Ok, bienvenidos y bienvenidas al Rincón del Profe Jeff. Welcome everyone to this next episode of El Rincón del Profe Jeff as we visit different countries in Latin America. As you can tell by the hat today, maybe you can, maybe you can't, but you'll see the colors of red, white, and blue, and then the emblem in the middle here is for the República del Paraguay. So maybe to help us out, we'll just turn around, then you can see the words. Fits a little bit better that way. Anyway, this hat is actually a souvenir from the 1998 Copa Mundial, the World Cup from France when Paraguay participated. They had a super famous goalie. His last name was Chilaver. Famous for kicking penalty goals against the other team as well. So pretty good character if you want to check that out as one of the people. But so let's dive into Paraguay. Remember, we always talk about the 4 Ps: the productos, prácticas, perspectivas, y personas, products, practices, perspectives, and people. And so we'll get into that. But I wanted to first tell you a little bit about why I have an interesting and connection with Paraguay. I've only been there for a very short time. It was a one-day trip, but it was through a sweet, wonderful old lady that I met in Argentina that I had my strongest connection with Paraguay. Let's jump to the map and we'll visit about that. So one of the first places that I lived in Argentina was a little town here on the coast called Necochea. And back in the day, I don't know that they're common anymore nowadays. My roommate and I lived in a thing called a pension, and a pension in English is more like a boarding house where families would have several rooms in their home, and then they would have boarders come in, and so there would be shared facilities. You typically had your own rooms. My roommate and I had our own room, but then there would be shared bathroom for everyone. But then there would be a common place for everyone in the boarding house to eat whichever meals you decided you wanted to have, and so we usually had dinner there. And the lady of the house, who was the owner, she and her husband owned it. Her husband was Argentino, he was Argentine, and she was from Paraguay. And the name of the boarding house, the pension, was Ipacaray. And Ipacaray is a place that's actually a word in Guaraní, which is the indigenous group that covers Paraguay. It's also their language, and so that was the name of the place in Paraguay where she was from. And so on a daily basis for 5 months, I lived in their boarding house for 5 months and ate her wonderful food. She introduced me to mandioca, which we know as yucca or cassava. She called it, I don't ever recall ever seeing it, and she showed it to me. I learned lots of Spanish from her as well, which I think Spanish was her second language. Her first language was Guarani. She called a mandioca una papa paraguaya, Paraguayan potato, and she used it in soups and stews all the time. So I remember vividly, after dinner and things were cleaned up, we'd go out or come back in, and she and her daughter would be in the kitchen drinking mate and talking in a different language than I was learning, which was Spanish. Of course, that was when I was first learning, but when I asked them about it, they would explain to me that they were talking in speaking in Guarani, which is a language of Paraguay. And that's a really cool aspect of Paraguay. You'll see Paraguay is situated here kind of in the heart of Latin America, of South America, surrounded by Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and Uruguay. But it's one of the only countries in the world where there are two official languages, and one of those official languages is an indigenous language, and that's Guarani. So I still have memories of she and her daughter spending hours chatting in Guarani, and it probably reminded them, took them back home to their the place they were from. Zooming in here, this lake here is called Ipacaray, which is close to the capital of Asunción, and there's a little town. That's where she and her family were from. So, shout out to Senora Traficante. Introduced me to some great food, both Argentine food and Paraguayan food, and always provided good memories. Left me with the desire to want to go there. Only got to go there for a day. You'll hear about here in a little bit, but obviously shows the influence that the indigenous group, the Guarani, have on the country. Again, two official languages, and it's also the name of their currency, the Guarani, and so many other things as well. All right, well, while we're on the map, before we get into some of the other products and some of the other P's that we're covering, let's talk about how Paraguay ended up being where it is and the size that it is today. Obviously, all countries in the world fluctuate from prehistoric to colonial to current times. And Paraguay is no different. Paraguay and Bolivia are the only two landlocked countries in South America. And Paraguay happens to be the smallest. Nevertheless, it was one of the most important parts of the Spanish colonies in Latin America, because you can see it's kind of in the center of everything. It was easy to travel from Asunción over into Bolivia, Chile, Peru, or to Brazil and down to Argentina. You'll see that Asunción is located on the river. It's right here on the Rio Paraguay, and that Rio Paraguay comes down here forms one of the borders with Argentina and joins with the Rio Paraná, which comes down from the east over here and is the border with Brazil and Argentina to form the Rio Paraná, which then ends up down here in Rio de la Plata. So that is a navigable river, so there's a lot of commerce that travels up and down the river from Buenos Aires to Asunción. Asunción was established in the 1500s, 1537, I think it is the official date for the Spanish colony to be there. And from that time, it had influence in all those places. One of the most drastic events came with what's called in Spanish La Guerra de la Triple Alianza, the War of the Triple Alliance. And the Triple Alliance was Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. And as they were trying to get more and more territory, those three countries went up against poor little Paraguay here, and it devastated Paraguay, not only in land, but it took almost half of their population as they fought in that war. It was a war that lasted for six years, from 1864 to 1870. So obviously something that affected Paraguay there. You'll notice another part of Paraguay, it's the western portion of the country over here is called, along with, you'll see there's a province in Argentina called El Chaco. So this is the Gran Chaco, and it runs up into Bolivia. And so Bolivia and Paraguay also they called it the Guerra del Chaco in the 1930s. Paraguay didn't end up losing any territory because of it, but of course, anytime there's war, it does have an effect on the population. So that's how Paraguay became Paraguay of today, as far as borders and a little bit of the history. As always, the information that I share, pictures and videos, are all shared for educational purposes. And I'll remind you, for those who are watching the podcast, that you'll want to check out the video description to see videos on different parts of Paraguay and the history, and I'll make specifics as we go through some of the P's. But just to talk about some important cities, the two that we'll bring up here will be obviously Asunción, which is the capital here, kind of right in the center. I will mention three, but one of the others is called the Ciudad del Este over here in the east, which shares a border with Brazil specifically, but it's really close to Argentina as well. In fact, the one-day visit that my wife and I made there was, we were with some friends at Iguazu Falls, staying in Puerto Iguazu, and we took a bus from Puerto Iguazu across into Brazil, which is called Foz de Iguazu Falls, and then across the river into Ciudad del Este. So we crossed two borders going in one way and two more borders coming back. Left in the morning, came back in the evening, and we'll talk more about that as well. Another important part is the Chaco over here, and one of the most famous cities in the western part is Philadelphia. The western part of Paraguay, there are well-known Mennonite colonies out there with, again, their own language. Obviously, they speak Spanish as well, but some German and Mennonite as well. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to jump out of the map view for a sec, and I'll pull up some of our pictures. We're going to talk about different parts of Paraguay and visit some of the products. That's always one of my favorite parts of the podcast, is telling you about products. Will make sense with some of the things that you see around me, and we'll make some connections with other countries as well, so we can see how, and as I've said many times, that we're all connected in different ways. Okay. All right. So the first picture I'm sharing, this is the capital, Asunción, governmental capital, commerce capital. Everything goes in the largest city in Paraguay. This image doesn't show it all that well, but you can see back here on the right-hand side, it's on the river there, the Rio Paraguayan River. I think this next image shows it a little better. Yeah, this is a little more close up, but you can see that obviously super connected to the river. They actually do have, they call it the Marina, the Navy, and so they patrol the rivers that form the borders with the other countries, the Rio Paraguay with Argentina, and the Rio Paraná with Brazil and Argentina. So chances are, if you're going to Paraguay, Asunción's going to be your in and out place, although the other place where a lot of people go, and I mentioned it briefly before, is called Ciudad del Este. This is the border town with Brazil. Because of its location with Brazil, and because Paraguay, the items, especially electronics and other types of things, clothes, stuff like that, things are cheaper in Paraguay than they are sometimes in Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay, the surrounding countries. And so a lot of people, I know they advertise in Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina about traveling to Paraguay just to go shopping. Okay, and so you'll see here on the streets, these are open air markets. Many times it's called the black market, where things are sold, but you'll also see that they've built fancy malls where non-black market things are sold. So it's kind of all available there. It's kind of known as a no man's land. People come and go frequently. When we went there, we were on this street. We did some shopping. There, the time we went, the big fancy shopping malls hadn't been built yet, and so we were left to deal with the black market and bought some things that I'll talk about here in a second. But the way to get into Ciudad del Este, it's called Puente Amistad, the friendship bridge between Brazil and Paraguay. Always people fly in as well. Most of the people fly into Brazil and then will take bus or Ubers or some other kind of method of transport across the bridge. But when my wife and I went, it was interesting because you'll see this bridge. On one side, people were walking into Paraguay with empty duffel bags and backpacks and things like that. And then on the other side, with the walking path coming back, so it was one direction going in, then the other direction coming out. All the backpacks and duffel bags were full of the merchandise that they had purchased, and were probably bringing it back to sell in Brazil or in Argentina. So interesting setup because of its position in Latin America. All right, this next picture is one of the coolest places that I've ever been in Latin America and in the world, actually, because it's pretty unique. This is called the Park of the Tres Hitos. An hito is like a post or a monument. And so what's happened here is this photo is taken from the perspective of standing in Argentina. So I'd be standing next to an Argentine flag and a little monument that has the Argentine colors. Across the river, this is the Iguazu River from Iguazu Falls. This is Brazil on the other side. Okay, and then across the other river, which is the Paraná River, we have Paraguay. And way back in the back there, you can see a little bit of the buildings and a little more of the pollution. That's Ciudad del Este. So this is one of the only places you can go and have three countries that meet in the river. In fact, you could take that boat out and they actually spin around, and so you can be in the three countries at once if you're right in the exact spot. It kind of reminded me of if you've ever been in New Mexico in the Four Corners region, you can visit the place where Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah meet. You can stand in all four places once. You can be in three countries at once if you're on the boat. So up there by Ciudad del Este. Okay, well, let's talk about some of the products. We already mentioned Guarani, the language, Spanish and Guarani. Just to add on that Guarani is many times, and some statistics that I've seen show or say that 90% of the people in Paraguay speak Guarani. And that's people who aren't necessarily, they don't have indigenous ancestry either. They learn it in schools. It's taught officially in schools. It many times, though, is the language of the home, like I had shared in the intro with Senora Traficante and her daughter speaking Guarani in the home, and that's kind of the language of the heart. I've heard it said that way for people in Paraguay. It's the language of del corazón, language of their heart, of their soul. And so that's what they do at home. But then when they go out and to school and to work and other places outside the home, Spanish is the language that's used. So I've shared some links in the video description so you can kind of hear what it's like. I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I never did officially try and learn it, other than a few words like that. Ipacaray, which is one of the words that I learned from Senora Traficante. So check those out, especially if you're interested in linguistics and languages. So beyond the language, obviously the culture is going to influence in a lot of the products that we'll see. And one of those, which we've already seen in also Argentina and Uruguay, is mate. Jump out here for a sec. I've got here my little mate container from Paraguay. It's smaller than actually the one that I'll put it back up on the screen in a sec. But you'll notice that it's not quite as thick as the ones we've had for Uruguay or Argentina, and that's because in Paraguay they call their drink that they use these cups for, they call it tereré. And tereré, instead of using hot water, uses cold water, in many cases iced water, in which they pour, it's the same yerba mate, which is actually a product from the Guaraní indigenous people, and it's had that influence that's gone to all of these other countries in Brazil and Uruguay and Argentina. The difference being, and we'll jump back on the screen here, is that because it is warmer in Paraguay, they don't use the hot water, they use iced water, and they add to it different herbs and flavors so that when you pour the water in, it combines with the yerba mate that's in the tereré to provide a tasty, refreshing drink. You'll see there the names that they have it. Instead of mate, it's called a guampa. The bombilla is the same thing with the straw, and then they have the jarro or termo. That one's decorated with some Ñandutí, which we'll talk about in a minute, another product of the combination of Guarani and Paraguay. So you'll see then the Guarani, the yerba mate, which they cultivated, and it became popular through Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. That's one thing that they have in common. So, okay. Up next, we have, the photo didn't turn out all that great here, but one of the breads that's very common in Paraguay is called Chipa, and there's some videos and recipes in the video description here. It's a bread that's accompanied probably pretty much every meal in Paraguay. This is just one recipe in one form. I've seen them in circles like tiny bagels or donuts, though they're much better in my opinion. And I'm sure there are recipes that are passed down for generations in different families. So check that out when you get the chance and try and make some for yourself. Okay, one of the unique instruments from Paraguay is called the Paraguayan harp, and has a distinct sound. It's smaller than a regular harp that we might see in orchestras. I came to know it actually before I went to Argentina, because back in the 80s, I know that's dating us, one of the contestants for Miss America pageant, that's when everybody watched them. I'm not sure how many people watch them now, just random comments there, but you know how they have talent show or talent portions of the competition. One of the contestants, she actually ended up winning Miss America that year, did her talent portion using the Paraguayan harp. She's actually sang she sang a song in Spanish and played it there. The links in the description below. Check out that and some of the other videos. It's really a fun sound. Okay, so next product we're going to talk about, which I mentioned briefly when you saw the picture of the termo with the tereré, is called Ñandutí. And Ñandutí is kind of like a spider web. The Ñandutí is the Guarani word. I understand it as meaning spider web, and it describes the embroidery that is one of the crafts that people practice in Paraguay. The one on the screen is very colorful. We're going to jump out of, it's all very colorful and intricate, but you'll see behind me all of the backdrop things except for the flags Oh, there's our yerba mate for the tereré and the Guarani influence, but all of the things behind me are samples of Ñandutí. These are some of the things my wife and I got when we were in Ciudad del Este. You'll notice, I'll just pull this one up here, that the embroidery is very intricate. The one on the screen before had many colors in it. You'll see this over here is actually a bedspread with some panels that are joined together with Ñandutí, but very intricate and impressive work. You'll see in some of the videos and descriptions that I shared. One of them just is music and shows you different types of Ñandutí. Another one shows you it's in Spanish, but you can get the gist of it. It's visiting some of the weavers, the embroiderers who are producing Ñandutí now. With the colors and intricacies that it is. I've seen pictures of ladies with dresses completely made out of Ñandutí, kind of like this, where they take panels and then hook and embroider them together. But one of my favorite influences, when you remember the word Ñandutí, spider webs, it gets the whole image together for us. So again, check those out. All right, we talked about how Paraguay is a small country, but it does have a huge influence when it comes to energy produced by hydroelectric dams. And now I know could be a controversial subject, though Paraguay and Brazil tout hydroelectric energy as being one of the most sustainable energies, renewable and sustainable because of the water that is available down there. Of course, when dams like this are built, there's always going to be the destruction of natural lands and animal life. In fact, when I was reading about this is the Itaipu Dam. It's on the Paraná River. So the part over here on the right-hand side is in Brazil, and the river halfway down the middle of the dam is where the border is for Paraguay, which is on the left-hand side. And so I read stories about once they got everything built and then shut off the river, that it filled up faster than they had expected and actually caused a little bit more devastation than they had expected. The other side of that is it now provides enough electricity to where 99% is the most recent statistic that I saw. 99% of Paraguay, or the people in Paraguay, have access to electricity if they want it. And it's fairly cheap for them, which speaks a lot for one of the smallest and not necessarily poorest, but one of the more struggling countries in Latin America. So, that being said, Paraguay, in this case, has done a joint project with Brazil called Itaipu, and part of it goes to Brazil and part of it goes to Paraguay. So Paraguay actually has enough energy that they sell more to Brazil than they make with their own generators. And further down the river and close to Argentina, Jacaretá, they have another project with Argentina where they have produce electricity and sell it to Argentina. So they're an energy exporter to other countries in Latin America. Now, this dam was built in the 70s, and I had heard about it and was one of my goals to see it. Let me pull we'll pull the map back up here. And so I told you about my wife and I making the trip. Let's switch this to the satellite version so we can get a little bit better detail. So we were staying with friends in Puerto Iguazu. They decided not to go with us to Ciudad del Este, so they were hanging out there. We took the bus from Puerto Iguazu in Argentina, crossed over into Brazil, and then crossed over into Ciudad del Este. And you'll see that up here is the Itaipu project. And we were trying to find out how to get there, what was the best way. And so somebody told us about a bus that went out there. And so we hopped on the bus. This was after we'd done our shopping. So it wasn't the best plan, but we were carrying all of our stuff. Some of it is that's here with us. And we got out here into the countryside, and the bus said, "This is as far as I go." And so we had to hop out. So my wife and I were walking through the countryside with, they were red dirt roads at that time, red mud, clay. And off to the sides were huge termite mounds, because they're all over the place there. 3, 4, 5 feet tall, some of them. And it was afternoon, maybe noon, 1 o'clock, maybe 1:30 or 2. I don't remember the exact time. So we hiked all our way out there, and they have a kind of a visitor center where you go to. And so we got into the visitor center saying, "Okay, we'd like to take a tour." And the guy at the visitor center said, "Well, we're closed for siesta, for the siesta time in Paraguay. And, we'll open up in a couple of hours." But we didn't have the time to wait, because we were supposed to meet back in Puerto Iguazu with our friends, because we were going to be heading back to Buenos Aires later that night. So we hiked back, caught the bus that on its way back into town, and made our way back to Argentina. So pretty close, but didn't get our own pictures. We were able to take pictures of the dam that they had there in the visitor center. But that's my story about traipsing through the backcountry of Paraguay. So, but like I said, important to the people of Paraguay, because the electricity produced by those things enables them to do things that they probably wouldn't be able to. All right, we're going to jump back a little bit in history, bring up this picture of some Jesuit ruins. In the 1700s, as the Portuguese and the Spanish were colonizing this part of the world, obviously religion was part of the conquest that they were imposing. And one of the biggest orders that was involved in that was the Jesuits, los Jesuitas. So these are Jesuit ruins in Paraguay. If you go across the river Paraná into Argentina, there's actually a province called Misiones, because it's named after the Jesuit missions that are on that side of the river too. These are missions that the Jesuits built to the Guaraní indigenous people, and their efforts to evangelize them. What they were doing was they were gathering the Guaraní groups, and they became somewhat powerful, because they were learning. The Jesuits were actually teaching them things that they could do to survive in the new colony. But the governments of both Brazil and Spain were fearful that the Jesuits were gaining more and more influence and power, and so the governments did an expulsion order on them and actually sent people in to exterminate the Jesuits and the people that were living in and around those missions. I've put a link in. There's a great movie. It's a little bit old, from the 80s, called The Mission. Stars Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro, who were Jesuit priests. So if you want to see a little bit about that history, and it was actually filmed in those places, you'll see Iguazu Falls and surrounding places. It does have some interesting perspectives on what took place in that part of their history. So there are ruins both by Encarnación and Trinidad in Paraguay, and then by San Ignacio in Argentina. Okay, little bit more on history. So here's another thing that the countries we've talked about so far, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, have in common, and that is, unfortunately, dictators and dictatorships. This is a picture of Alfredo Stroessner, who was the dictator in Paraguay from 1954 up until 1989. And so quite a stronghold, the longest individual dictatorship of Latin America. You'll see I've shared some links. Some people see him as a hero. Some people see him as a villain. I'll let you make your decision. I'm always not a favor of dictators. But some people obviously had supported him, and of course he ruled with an iron hand. In 1989, he made the decision to step away. He obviously went into exile, actually into Brazil, and so after that point, Paraguay moved into a democratic government. So the democracy conquered or won, and the first democratically elected president in Paraguay was Juan Carlos Wasmusi. Here's a picture of him. I included in the link, he gave a speech to a gathering on peace. I think the date was 2014, but check that out. He delivered the speech in Spanish, and he has some interesting things to say, especially as he's actually an engineer in real life, but as he engineered the transition from the dictatorship to being a democratically elected president in Paraguay. So that represented the end of that dictatorship in Paraguay. Okay. So, as with many of the countries we've talked about already, similarities, differences. One of the, as I've already shared before, the thing that I appreciate the most is the people. Going back to Señora Traficante and my first contact with Paraguayans. I've met many Paraguayans since my time, most of them here in the United States, but always open people, very loving, and they have a passion for their country and for their language, especially Guarani. And so, as is typical with all of the episodes that I share here on Rincón del Profe Jeff, I like to close with a quote or thought from one of the famous authors from these countries. And the author that I've selected for Paraguay is Augusto Roa Bastos, who is one of the most famous Paraguayan authors. And he's talking about especially the language. So his statement is, and then we'll extend that thought here in a little bit after I finish that. Again, always in Spanish first, then in English. So Augusto Roa Bastos says, "Las raíces de un pueblo no están en la tierra, sino en su lengua." Translated means the roots of a people are not in the earth or in the land, they are in their language. That's evidenced by Guarani being such an important part. And so what we can say about that is he's reminding us, en Paraguay, las raíces del pueblo laten en su lengua, en su historia y en su capacidad de resistir. So the roots of the people beat in their language, in their history, and in their capacity to resist. And obviously from the brief history that we've given here, they've been through a lot and have still overcome. Es un país que nos invita a descubrir la profundidad de su identidad y a conectarnos con sus tradiciones vivas. It's a country that invites us to discover its profoundness, the the depth of its identity, and to connect with its lively traditions. So with that, I hope you enjoyed our visit to Paraguay and the connections I have. Hopefully you can make some of your own connections through the things you've learned or want to explore on your own. And always invite comments in the video description on YouTube. Help me if I've made something wrong. If you have some more questions about Paraguay or we want to discover something else, feel free to mention that. Okay? Muy bien, muchas gracias. Adiós.